We spend a lot of time learning, understanding ideas, concepts, frameworks, but there's a gap that most people never cross. The gap between understanding something and actually living it. In the language of Torah, that gap is the difference between Binah and Das. Binah is when something makes sense. Das is when what you understand and how you actually live are aligned. This series is about closing that gap, taking ideas that we understand intellectually and turning them into something real, something lived. We'll be working with Torah teachings that approach this with precision and structure. So this is not a series about inspiration. It's a series about process, a structured path from Binah to Das. Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the Shema podcast and our next installment of the From Binah to Das Stage 2, the architecture of creation. Before we get into the topic today, I want to reiterate the goal of this series, specifically the Stage 2. By first stating what it is not. It is not a series about learning a bunch of interesting, cool things about spiritual worlds and souls and angels in order to satisfy some intellectual curiosity or win at a game of Jewish trivia. It's not the purpose here. The goal here is to understand, to the best of our ability, to the extent Torah allows, the system Hashem created through which he interacts with us and through which we interact with him. And we can't understand the entire system all at once. Each of these series will be like building bricks, one at a time, layering it up. But in the end, we are constructing something here. And that's why I'm being very careful, too, with the organization of how I discuss and research these areas so that each episode has purpose to it and it makes sure that everything's being delivered in a sequential order so that we're able to build a full framework of this system. But before we can understand how this whole system works together and how Hashem's will reaches us, how our prayer operates, how mitzvos can affect spiritual reality, or how prophecy was once possible, we first need a map of the environment in which we exist. We need to not only understand what kind of environment we actually live in, but we need to understand that how the Jew is connected to it. And that is the limited goal of this episode. We are not yet explaining how the entire system operates. We are simply today going to establish the environment in which those later processes take place. Much earlier in the From Binah to Das series, we studied a teaching of the Ba Hasulam that became one of the primary inspirations for this entire Stage 2 project. It was from his essay, "For My Flesh I Shall See God." And it explains that physical and spiritual knowledge are acquired in totally opposite ways. In the physical world, we can experience reality before we understand the system behind it. For instance, a child knows that objects fall long before understanding the laws of gravity. Lived knowledge comes before understanding, something we've discussed before. And spiritual reality works differently because it is concealed from our ordinary senses. We cannot simply experience it first and then work backward to understand how it operates. So the Baal Salam says that we must first acquire knowledge of what he calls the nature of the systems of the spiritual worlds. And through that understanding, spiritual reality can begin to be attained. We first get the Binah, the understanding of how everything operates, and then through that understanding, we can begin to gain the Das, the experience of spirituality, of living in a world with Hashem. Before turning to the structure itself, there's also a larger historical reason that the inner dimension of Torah that we are discussing here matters. And it's something we've discussed before. But again, just in case someone is tuning into this podcast for the first time, and just to bring it to the forefront of our mind, I will state it again. The Zohar and the Tikkun Zohar connect the revelation and study of the inner dimension of Torah with the process of redemption. And Baal Salam develops that connection further. He argues that giving the inner dimension of Torah its proper place is itself part of the spiritual process through which redemption will unfold. That means that as history moves towards Mashiach, the deeper structure beneath Torah, mitzvos, the human being, and creation becomes increasingly important to understand. So again, this is why we are delving into this. This is why I want to learn this. This is why I want to support my learning by teaching it. And whoever else is interested in learning this can come on this journey with me. But again, we are not studying all these ideas because they are fascinating. We are trying to understand the inner architecture of the world so that Torah becomes more integrated and Hashem's involvement becomes more recognizable, and our responsibility within creation becomes clear. There is a misperception that one should not learn such things until they know all of Torah, or that they know basic halacha, and that they are keeping the mitzvos. Through this learning, someone who is not keeping the mitzvos, someone who's not keeping Shabbos yet, not keeping kosher, not wearing tefillin, not doing anything, I can assure you that by listening and learning through this series with me, that person will be more compelled to want to keep the mitzvos, because they're going to totally understand that they're not arbitrary actions. They're not simply cultural traditions. They will see that those actions, especially for a Jew, radiate and permeate all of existence. So let's get into this. Now that we have established the purpose. So our first task is to challenge the picture of reality that our sensory perception gives us. We live almost entirely at the level of what we can see. Livelihood appears to come from an employer or customer or inheritance or some other source. Health appears to be governed by biology and medicine. Weather seems to follow atmospheric conditions. Markets respond to economic forces. All of these physical mechanisms are completely real. The question is whether what is available to our senses represent the entire system or only the visible part of it. And this really all used to be a lot more intuitive. But in history, with the evolution of Greece and what they came to represent in creation, that their goal was to break apart physical reality from its spiritual roots. And we find ourselves, especially those who did not grow up with Torah, analyzing and evaluating the world simply off the physical manifestation that is in front of us and that is easily detectable by the five senses. Now, the previous episode gave us a reason to ask the question. So again, the question is whether what is available to our senses represents the entire system or only the visible part of it. And the previous episode gave us a reason to ask that question. We examined how the serpent corrupted Chava's perception of reality and how the sin that followed changed the human condition. The Torah says that Adam and Chava, their eyes were opened, yet what they immediately perceived was their nakedness. And we explored the possibility that after the sin, human beings became more identified with the physical presentation of themselves and of reality and less able to perceive the unity beneath it. I think a good analogy here is that before the sin, their relationship with the body was more similar to our relationship with our cars. No one really identifies as their car. Maybe some people. Maybe in Texas, someone with their pickup truck may identify with their truck. But for the most part, we don't identify with our car. Our car is just something we have access to that gets us around from point A to point B. And that is the reality of our body, allows who we are, neshama, to get from point A to point B. And that is Adam and Chava's, it was their relationship with their body until the sin. After the sin, they began to identify with the body, which again would be like us all of a sudden identifying with our car. And that is why after the sin, the first thing they noticed was that they were naked. Nothing had changed except for the fact that they were now identifying with the car instead of the fact that they were the ones inside the car. So if our present perception is itself limited by the condition we now live in, the next question is unavoidable. What kind of reality are we actually trying to perceive? The goal of today's episode. So to build the actual map, we first have to define what Torah means when it speaks about physical reality and spiritual reality. And we get a lot of great help from the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, in his book Derech Hashem, and he describes spiritual existence as created reality without matter, and therefore not perceivable through our ordinary physical senses. Souls and other non-material beings belong to that category. So spiritual does not simply mean holy or meaningful, emotional, whatever else. Ramchal is describing a genuine category of created existence that is non-material and ordinarily inaccessible to the senses. And this is not a big jump at all, I think, for any of us in the year 2026. I've shared before that my first Torah book, sort of say that in quotation marks, was a book on quantum mechanics, as the author of the book was describing the process they went through to uncover and discover the quark, a subatomic particle not detectable by the sensory perception. And the author of the book spent a great deal of time talking about how physicists knew that our sensory perception was limited, and there was a whole realm of reality that they had learned about that we never saw, never heard, never touched. So I think it's not difficult for us today in our age to understand there's a lot going on that we are just physically blind to, but that yet does not deny its existence. So this gives us our first correction to the map. What we can see and touch is real, but Torah does not identify sensory reality with the whole of creation. Once we know that physical and spiritual reality are different categories, the next step is to understand how they are connected rather than imagining them as two unrelated worlds. So in Ramchal's book, Derech Hashem, he explains that physical things have higher roots above them, one above another, extending back toward what he calls the first forces. So what appears here in physical form stands at the end of a larger chain. That gives us the first major piece of the architecture. A physical object or even an event can be completely real without being the beginning of its own causal story. For example, let's suppose a person puts their hand in a fire. We understand what will take place. The heat will transfer onto their tissue. The cells will become damaged. They will scream because pain signals will travel through the nervous system. And nothing in Ramchal's model is asking us to deny any part of that mechanism and that set of cause and effect events that would occur. The question is whether describing the physical mechanism has taken us all the way back to the beginning of causation. And Ramchal's answer is no. The physical form itself has higher roots. So the principle we will be carrying forward is that physical mechanisms, objects, events, they're all real, but Torah describes them as visible expressions of a larger causal order whose roots extend beyond the physical level. I think a way to think about this is we know from quantum mechanics and that on a molecular level, you have atoms made of neutrons and protons. And then from there, all the components are made of smaller and smaller component pieces that are, again, not visible to the naked eye. But at a certain point, all that somehow interacts with this spiritual reality. It's just physicists haven't gotten back that far. On Shabbos morning, I learned from our friend Daniel Kotler, who I've had on this podcast before. He teaches Chassidus every Shabbos after our minyan in the morning. And I don't remember who he was quoting, but he was saying how when Mashiach comes, we'll have the mathematics for all this. Like in our physics class, we'll not only have the mathematics for all the quantum world, but how all that connects within and ties into the spiritual realm. We're just not there yet. But right now, thank God, we have the Ramchal, we have Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, several other great sources that are going to help us clarify this today. So the larger causal chain now allows us to ask what Torah means by higher and lower worlds, and why those terms describe levels of reality rather than physical distance. It's a key idea I want to make sure that everyone understands, because our imagination naturally hears higher and lower, and you begin to think of space and distance. And Rav Chaim Volozhin in Nefesh Chaim warns against imagining that Hashem himself is more present in one location, less present in another. And the fact is that Hashem fills all worlds. So I used to think when I first started delving into this and learning about the four worlds is that we had our physical world, the universe, and then outside of that, wherever that finite boundary is, as vast as it is, then we have the next world of Yetzirah. And then outside that, there's some sphere of Berea, and there are like these different levels that further and further distances away. This is not the case at all. A more useful way to understand this, and the idea of higher and lower, is in terms of revelation and concealment. At higher levels, creation's dependence upon Hashem is more apparent. At lower levels, that dependence becomes increasingly concealed, as we obviously know. In our world of Asiya, the world of action, there's a lot of the world that walks around with no acknowledgement whatsoever of their creator. And we can be honest with ourselves. I spent a lot of the day walking around totally not aware and acknowledging the fact that I was being emanated into existence in every moment, and that every step I took was being allowed by the benevolence of my creator. Every step, every movement, I was going on my day without any acknowledgement of that whatsoever. So that can only take place in this world. In the other worlds, the revelation is higher. The angels are always aware of these things, that Hashem is creating them and sustaining them in every moment. So maybe a suggestion is it's more of a different dimension, but they're not realms that are spatially distant from us. So let's go through the four worlds. We have at the highest level, Atzilus, and then Berea, Yetzirah, and then Asiya, as I said, which means action. As this is the world of action, this world we have space and we have time. So there's movement, things to do, mitzvos to do, etc. Rav Chaim Volozhin's framework helps us understand this movement as involving progressively greater concealment from the perspective of created beings. The important point is that creation itself is described as layered, and physical reality is not an isolated universe. It is the lowest visible expression within a larger ordered structure. So before we get to the Jew and mankind within this structure and where we fit in, we need to establish one more foundational idea, because this is going to be extremely important and pivotal as we progress through this series. And that is that Torah is not outside creation and giving it instructions. Torah is bound up within the design of creation. In Bereshis Rabbah, which is an early midrashic collection of teachings from Chazal on the book of Bereshis, opens with an analogy. It says, "A king who builds a palace does not do so without plans." The Midrash then says that Hashem looked into the Torah and created the world. And that is the source behind the familiar statement that Torah is the blueprint of creation. This changes the way we should think about mitzvos and halakha. It means Torah is not a religious rule book placed on top of a independently existing universe after the creation was complete. The Midrash places Torah at the level of the design according to which creation itself was brought into existence. If that's not totally clicking in your mind, it will as we progress through this series. I'm certain of it. Another idea to share with you at this juncture, just to add a little more weight to this idea, is that in the Gemara, in Bava Metzia, there's a famous story about Rabbi Eliezer, and it was on his halakhic position on the oven of Achnei. And he starts bringing all these miraculous signs to support his position, including a heavenly voice that comes out and sides with him. But the halakha becomes what the majority of the sages say. And the majority of sages said the opposite of his position. So even though the heavens were coming in supporting Rabbi Eliezer's position, the sages said, well, we don't care. We ruled and we're the majority. And they told the heavens a principle of the Torah, which is the Torah is not in heaven. Once we receive the Torah, halakhic determination operates through the system Hashem entrusted to us, or to the sages of each generation. So basically, the sages overruled heaven on what the halakha was. And that's not just a cool fable. That is the reality of Torah in the world, and it's why it's pivotal we understand this idea. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this very specific topic. For now, we only need the foundation, and that is Torah belongs to the architecture of creation itself, and Hashem has given the Jewish people a real role within that Torah system of creation. Now that the basic environment is in place, we can locate where the human being fits in with all of it, and also understand the particular role Torah gives to Klal Yisrael within the larger picture and the larger structure. There's a book called The Gate of Reincarnations, which is a major Kabbalistic work based on the teachings of the Arizal and as recorded by his student, Rab Chaim Vatel, and describes the 5 levels of the soul: the nefesh, the ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida. And it also teaches that the human being connects all 4 worlds. As we mentioned, Atzilus, Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiya. Our nefesh soul is attached to the world of Asiya, this world. Our ruach is attached to the world of Yetzirah. The neshama is attached to the world of Beriah, and chaya is attached to the world of Atzilus. And Yechida, that level of soul, is even a higher dimension and doesn't even actually fit into that forward world mapping. Rav Chaim Volozhner develops the larger principle in his book Nefesh Chaim, and he describes the human being as standing within a vast network of worlds and spiritual powers, with action, speech, and thought producing effects beyond the visible physical level. So in other words, Torah does not present a human being as an isolated physical creature whose choices terminate at the edge of their body, nor even the impact we have on others directly in contact with us. What we are learning here, through what I just described, that infrastructure, is what we do reverberates throughout the entire structure of creation. And as you begin to internalize this, it should give you pause. It should give you some seriousness to our lives and what they mean. As I said in the beginning of this episode, this is going to bring a lot more gravity and seriousness to how we live as Jews, our fulfillment of the mitzvos and halakha, and our learning Torah, and the way in which we treat one another. But within the universal human picture, as I sort of referenced already, Torah assigns the Jewish people a specific responsibility, as we were the ones given Torah mitzvos. And Rav Chaim Volozhin teaches that when Israel engages in Torah, that Torah provides illumination, vitality, and sustenance to the worlds, not just this entire world, but all the worlds. So the distinction we're making here is not a statement about one human being having greater worth than another. It's just simply a distinction of role and responsibility within creation. I know a lot of these ideas are not new to those of you who have been tuned in for a while to this podcast. But now I think you're seeing the architecture of how everything is structured and connected. And just to drive home this point a little further, this means that a Jew, that we should not picture a mitzvah as merely a private religious act performed inside an otherwise unrelated physical universe. For example, if a Jew puts on tefillin, the significance of that act does not stop with the person wearing them. What Rav Chaim Voloshin's framework is saying is that that act participates in the spiritual order of creation itself. And the same principle carries responsibility in the other direction. Sadly, but true, our failures as a people introduce damage and further concealment in the larger order. So again, not just in this world that we negatively impact things on the other side of the planet, but we're impacting negatively the other worlds. And this is why Torah places such enormous responsibility upon Klal Yisrael. This makes me think too about when people go through a authentic conversion process, how it's so difficult. We just had a friend over not too long ago who's, I think, been in the process 5 or 6 years. But they're very serious about this process, and this is why. Because once a non-Jew becomes Jewish, now they're wired in to all 4 worlds. And we already have enough Jews who are by birth wired into all 4 worlds, even thinking like me in my teens and 20s, and all my acts were like just totally destroying the entire cosmos from everything I was doing. And so that's why we want to make sure that someone converts for all of our sake, for all of humanity in the world. They know how to keep the mitzvos, and they're dedicated to keeping the mitzvos. But when someone becomes a Jew like this, and they're that committed, it's a big win for all of us. It really is. And that's why they are treated with such love and reverence, because of the contribution they know they're making to all of Klal Yisrael and the entire cosmos. Now, considering everything is connected this way, and it's all connected to us, we should never look at a particular war or tragedy or illness or blessing and claim that we know that this action caused this to happen. We don't have that knowledge. We shouldn't pretend to have that knowledge. But we can say that something structural, that we as a Jewish people were given a particular covenantal role with creation, and therefore our Torah, our mitzvos, our prayer, our speech, our thought, our action have consequences, extending far beyond our own private lives. And for anyone listening who's not Jewish, I know many of you are out there, the point is not that your life stands outside Hashem's creation or lacks spiritual significance. God forbid. Of course, it's not true. It's quite the opposite. We've already seen Rav Chaim Voloshin speak about the human being as participating in the larger order. What we are identifying here is the additional responsibility that Torah places upon a Jew through the covenant of the Torah and mitzvos. And this is why later questions about prayer, exile, redemption, prophecy, and human spiritual influence will make much more sense once this full architecture is in place, which is why I'm trying to methodically go through and build this. So everyone has a good working knowledge before we begin to add in more pieces. If human beings are connected into a larger spiritual structure, and Klal Yisrael has been given Torah as a particular means of acting within that structure, then a physical mitzvah affecting realities above no longer sounds like one disconnected universe somehow reaching into another. I want to touch back on something we discussed in the previous episode, and I'm referring to the episode titled "The Serpent's Method: The Corruption of Perception." And there we focus primarily on what Adam and Chava's sin changed within the human being, and how perception became more fragmented, and how the body became more dominant in our experience, and how spiritual reality became harder for us to perceive directly. Here, however, we need to make a broader architectural point. And this is something I used to not understand correctly. So I'm glad I reread this. I'm glad I researched this again. According to Ramchal, the sin did not just change Adam and Chava. It changed creation itself. Bereshit Rabbah preserves the famous tradition from Rab Meir about how the garments of light became garments of skin. And Ramchal states explicitly that through Adam's sin, both the human being and the world were altered from their original condition. And so there were deficiencies introduced into both. The Gemara gives another important clue about how different the original condition was. It describes Adam in Gan Eden interacting directly with angels. There's actually text about how the ministering angels were roasting meat and straining wine while Adam was chilling out in the garden. Sounds pretty cool. The whole debate was on where this meat came from. He wasn't eating animals then, but it was some type of amazing meat that Hashem sent right down from Shemayim. And the angels sit there and roasted it for him. And he just chilled out on his lawn chair in the garden, and they made wine for him. Sounds awesome. We need to get it back there. But this is telling us something about the structure and the architecture of the world and what changed. Whatever the exact mode of that experience was, the text is presenting the fact that there was an embodied human being living in a reality in which interaction with spiritual beings was part of the normal experience. So taken together, these sources suggest something important. Adam's original condition was not simply that he was more spiritually sensitive and living in the same world we inhabit today, but yet that the human being and the environment itself became different. Adam was less concealed from spiritual reality, and the world itself was less concealing of its spiritual reality. So taken together, this means that, just to concretize his point, that post-sin, the human condition, and the environment we're describing here that we're learning about, that also changed. And so this gives us a final piece of the map before we bring everything together. The world we experience today is not merely the original creation being viewed through impaired human perception. The created environment itself is also in a more deficient condition. And taken together, these sources give us reason to understand that condition as more concealing of spiritual reality. So when we say that our senses reveal only part of reality, we are really describing two layers of concealment. For one, we are diminished perceivers of spirituality, and two, we are living within a diminished and more concealed world. So now we can bring these pieces together and see the kind of reality Torah is describing. Our ordinary sensory experience is not a complete map of creation. We've learned that Ramchal describes spiritual existence as real and non-material, and he teaches that physical things have higher roots. Kabbalistic sources describe ordered worlds and a soul connected through them. Torah itself is presented as part of the design of creation, and Klal Yisrael is given a particular role within that structure through Torah and mitzvos. And this does not make physical reality false or unimportant. It just means that physical reality is not self-contained. When medicine affects biology, fire burns, weather follows atmospheric processes, or markets respond to economic forces, those mechanisms are all completely real. So we're not trying to choose between nature did it and Hashem did it as though they are competing explanations. Instead, it's the physical mechanism is describing what is happening at the level available to our senses. And the Torah is telling us that this visible level belongs to a larger causal structure whose roots extend beyond what we can see. And the same is true of the human being. We are not simply physical creatures standing inside that physical layer. The soul is connected into a much larger architecture. And that helps explain why Torah describes human thought, speech, action, Torah and mitzvos as having consequences beyond the immediate physical act. There was an idea I read, can't remember the source, but it's around the idea of Lashon Hara. Now, of course, it's obvious that if someone speaks something negative about someone else to someone else, then other person goes and tells someone else, the person's reputation becomes ruined. It creates a chain of events that causes damage. But through what we just described, now you can understand this other idea that if you were to stand on a deserted island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and say something negative about someone, it would have a negative implication on that person in the world because of this whole idea, that we are so interconnected to all of reality. So the picture we now have is not of a physical universe sitting beside a separate spiritual universe somewhere else far away. Now I hope you can sort of see that this is one ordered creation. There's a physical realm, a spiritual realm. They're sort of overlaid with each other. And the physical world is the part directly available to our senses, but there's deeper roots, levels, forces, and dimensions that remain concealed from our ordinary perception. And after Adam's sin, the concealment is even greater. Not only was the human being changed, but Ramchal teaches that creation itself was altered from its original creation. So that is the map we need to build before we begin asking the next questions, which are what we'll be getting into in the next episode, which are what beings and forces operate within the system, and then how Hashem's influence moves through it, and how our own actions affect it in return. We will be identifying the different agents within creation, specifically human beings, animals, malachim, and shadim, and other spiritual forces Torah describes, and understand their distinct roles that Hashem assigns to each of them. So today we focused on the environment, the infrastructure. Next time we'll get into all these agents, including more about the human being and all the spiritual beings and the animals, their purpose, and how they all influence the broader system. But once we know who the agents are, a deeper question will open up that we will tackle, and that is, has the human role within the system always been the same? Rabbi Akiva Tatz, in his book, As Dawn Ends the Night, develops a complete picture of Jewish history and how our role in the world did change significantly as the degree of divine revelation changed. And I want to give a shout out and thank my dear friend and friend of the podcast I've had on before, David Block, who sent this book to me and put it on my radar. And I've read through it, and it's going to be a valuable source of content for this series. And especially as we get into this whole idea of how the system itself has been changing over the millennium and by design. As Adam begins in a world far more transparent to spiritual reality, at Sinai, Klal Yisrael experiences an extraordinary level of revelation again. But later, as prophecy comes to an end and Jewish history moves through the eras of Purim and Hanukkah, overt divine revelation increasingly recedes, but something else moves into the foreground, and that is the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, and the authority of the sages, and a much greater degree of human participation in uncovering and bringing Torah into the world. So after we understand the different agents within creation, we'll trace that historical development carefully. What was the human being originally meant to do within the system? What changed after Adam? What did Sinai represent? What changed again when prophecy ended? And what does all that tell us about the role Hashem is asking us to play today? From there, we can finally begin examining the mechanics themselves. For instance, how divine influence moves downward through creation, how our Torah, mitzvos, prayer, thought, speech, and action move back upward through it. But I want to leave us with one thought before we close. This entire architecture we have been describing, all the worlds, all these levels, all the different beings and forces operating within it. They were not created simply so that we could understand an elaborate spiritual system. Hashem did not create this system merely for us to observe it. Torah describes the human being as having a job within it. The architecture exists for a purpose for us, and we have been placed inside it as participants. So ultimately, the question of this series is not simply, how does creation work? It is, what did Hashem build this entire system for? What role has He given us within it? And how are we supposed to do that job?
Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode and found it meaningful, please take a moment to rate, review, and share the podcast.